Hello everyone, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over two creepy, solved disappearances, but despite them being solved, they are no less disturbing. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. In the summer of 2004, on the beautiful Spanish island of Mallorca, a bartender stood at a bar, going about his day, laughing and joking with the tourists coming for a vacation. Although the bartender wasn't originally from there, he had a nice little life for himself. He had friends and a girlfriend, and as far as a relaxing place to live, it didn't get much better than the island. However, in the next second, the man's life would completely change. Someone walked into the bar, and although the bartender didn't know who they were, they recognized him. This would be the beginning of the end for him. As a child, Mary Gow was always close to her parents and 5 brothers. According to her brother David, she was smart, easygoing, and fun to be around. On the other hand, she was also quieter and more reserved than many girls her age. Mary eventually got a job as a legal secretary in Balbriggan, Ireland, about 20 miles north of Dublin. At the same time, self-employed computer analyst Colin Whelan also lived in Balbriggan. And according to some sources, he knew Mary and her family for years. Up until then, though, they were just casual acquaintances. But that changed one evening in 1993 when they ran into one another at a local pub called the Huntsman Inn. Colin was handsome, driven, and outgoing, and at that point, Mary had never had a boyfriend. Needless to say, she was flattered that he showed her so much attention, and soon they began dating, and things got serious almost immediately. And Mary's parents and brothers welcomed Colin into the family with open arms. The couple would break up for a brief spell in 1995, but they got back together and bought a house in 1997. But then, tragedy struck when it looked like everything was falling into place. It's unclear where Colin went or who he was with on the night of Friday, January 31st, 1997, but there was a fair amount of alcohol in his system when he got behind the wheel of his car just before 10 p.m. Shortly thereafter, he was involved in a violent head-on collision with an elderly couple a few miles from town. And tragically, a 61-year-old woman was killed in the accident. Her husband was driving that night, but he and Colin walked away with relatively minor injuries. Afterward, Colin faced drunk driving and maybe even manslaughter or vehicular homicide charges, and if convicted, he could have spent years behind bars. To Mary, it looked like her once-in-a-lifetime romance was all but over. But in the end, Colin was only convicted of careless driving. The judge gave him little more than a slap on the wrist, and afterward, he never spoke about the accident to Mary, her family, or anyone else. Mary knew that this hung over him like a dark cloud, but they put it behind them and eventually announced that they were going to tie the knot in September of 2000. Mary worked tirelessly to ensure that no wedding detail got overlooked, because after all, everyone knew it was going to be the most important day of her life. Colin was also busy, but his preparations were far more private in nature. By early 2001, Colin and Mary had only been married for about 6 months, and at least on the outside, they still looked like the quintessential happy newlyweds. But this carefully crafted facade crumbled in dramatic fashion on the night of Wednesday, February 28th, when Colin dialed 999 in a frantic state. He would go on to tell the emergency operator that there had been a terrible accident in his home and his 27-year-old wife Mary was unconscious and bleeding from the nose. When police and EMTs arrived a few minutes later, he was kneeling over Mary at the bottom of the stairs. She was wrapped in a thick comforter, and by then, she'd flatlined. This was immediately more than a little odd because fall victims rarely experience heart failure. Either way, Mary was rushed to Beaumont Hospital. Colin followed in his car, and they arrived just after midnight on the morning of Thursday, March 1st, 2001. Tragically, though, emergency room physicians weren't able to resuscitate Mary, and she was pronounced dead on arrival a few minutes later. When the chaos finally subsided, they noticed that she had marks on her neck and chest that were more consistent with strangulation than a fall down a stairway. In addition, a nurse noticed that Colin had suspicious scratches on his chest. Mary's mother arrived at the hospital shortly after 1 a.m., and at that point, she only knew that her daughter had been injured in a tragic accident. As she ran down the hallway, she saw Colin slumped over on a bench with his head in his hands. When she asked how Mary was, he looked up and said, "She's dead." Mary's family was understandably inconsolable when they arrived at the hospital later that morning, but according to Mary's mother, Colin didn't even show the slightest bit of genuine emotion. And almost right away, detectives were pretty sure that Colin's version of events wasn't entirely accurate. For one, the accident looked staged. Mary's body seemed to be in a contrived and unnatural position. In addition, the ligature marks on her neck and the scratches on Colin's chest seemed to indicate a very different altercation. Then, later that day, a state pathologist confirmed that Mary's death had been caused by asphyxiation. The pathologist would also find an abrasion on Mary's back that indicated she'd been dragged across the floor after her death. To investigators, although they didn't have a direct admission, the evidence already seemed to be overwhelming. And incredibly, even more would come out following an investigation. When crime scene technicians searched the home, they found small drops of blood that matched samples taken from Mary during the autopsy. Investigators also dug into Colin's past to get an idea of his personality and the nature of his previous relationships. One former girlfriend said that Colin assaulted her multiple times even though they dated for only a short time, and later forensics found evidence of damning internet searches Colin made in the months leading up to his marriage and a convenient life insurance policy. Prior to getting married, he took out a $200,000 life insurance policy on his soon-to-be wife, and interestingly, he'd receive the double payment or £400,000 if she died within 10 years of their wedding date. Colin also did dozens of internet searches using phrases like loss of consciousness, strangulation, and asphyxiation. Even more disturbingly, he downloaded a transcript from a case in the United States in which serial offender Henry Louis Wallace did this to nearly a dozen women and wrapped some of their bodies in a comforter to delay the natural cooling process. Initially, when he was asked why he wrapped Mary in a comforter on the night she died, Colin claimed that the 999 operator instructed him to do it because it would keep her warm. But he apparently didn't know that 999 calls were recorded, so when investigators listened to the audio and reviewed the transcript, it was clear that the operator never gave him any such instructions. By then, the operating theory was that Colin murdered Mary in their bedroom, then he dragged her body down the stairs, staged it on the landing, and wrapped it in a comforter, just like Henry Louis Wallace. Colin was then arrested, charged with murder, and transported to Dublin's notorious Clover Hill prison in April of 2001. Surprisingly though, he was eventually released on bond, but to prevent him from fleeing, he had to surrender his passport and check in at the police station near his home every day while awaiting his trial, which was scheduled to begin in October of 2003. This 2-year delay gave Colin more freedom and breathing room than most defendants charged with such serious crimes, and for Mary's family, the waiting was absolutely unbearable. There was no guarantee that Colin would be convicted, and in the meantime, he was essentially a free man while they struggled to put their broken lives back together. In the early going, Colin worked with his attorneys, but by the spring of 2003, it was clear that the case against him was about as airtight as it possibly could be. Then, in March of that year, he disappeared without a trace. A few days later, his vehicle, clothes, and a few personal items were found at Howth Head on a towering cliff overlooking the Irish Sea. It initially looked like he cracked under the pressure and decided to end things on his own accord. At the same time, though, investigators had a suspicion that the same type of person who would potentially murder their wife would also be capable of staging their own passing. This was confirmed later when they discovered that he managed to get a new passport using a neighbor's name. 1,500 kilometers away, Colin was working as a bartender at a popular resort on the Spanish island of Majorca. By all accounts, he led a comfortable and fun-filled life there for more than a year. He made new friends, met tourists from all over the world, and even had a serious girlfriend. He told everyone that his parents were dead, that he didn't have any brothers or sisters, and that he'd probably never return to the country of his birth. By then, keeping his head down and blending with the crowd had become second nature. Colin's luck eventually ran out in the summer of 2004 when an Irish tourist familiar with Mary's death called the Irish police after recognizing him at the bar. With the help of the Spanish police, the 33-year-old was then arrested and flown back to Ireland in handcuffs a few weeks later. Colin pleaded guilty when his trial finally got underway at the Central Criminal Court in the spring of 2005. During the trial, he wore a dark suit, remained emotionless, and never took the stand in his own defense. In fact, the only time he spoke was to confirm his identity. The prosecution would go on to call a string of witnesses, including the detectives who worked the case as well as the medical examiner who performed the autopsy shortly after Mary's death. Their testimony was especially surprising to Mary's family because they weren't aware that Colin planned her murder or that he bought the life insurance policy months before they were married. Near the end of the trial, his defense attorney read a statement to Mary's mother and the rest of her family that apparently was written by Colin himself. It's unclear why Colin didn't read it himself, but whatever the case, he apologized for killing Mary and said that he'd live with the horrible regret and sorrow for the rest of his life. Needless to say, the statement came across as insincere. Afterward, Mary's mother addressed Colin in the court before the sentence was handed down. According to her, the one glaring mistake in her daughter's tragically short life was that she fell in love with Colin. As for his lukewarm apology, she claimed that he was only sorry that he got caught and that his charmed life in Majorca came to an abrupt end. But later, she told the press that being a grieving mother and attending to her sons was hard enough and that she just didn't have the time or energy to hold a grudge against him. Colin was then convicted and sentenced to life in prison. True to form, he remained stoic as his sentence was read.